Hello again. Okay, today we're going to talk about section 4 from the notes. Okay, and so this is entitled Good and Bad Arguments. We're going to talk mainly about bad arguments, um, simply because we've talked a little bit about how arguments should be at the beginning. We're going to take in, while talking about bad arguments, we're going to take in what's known as fallacy theory. Fallacy theory is basically the theory of what goes wrong in arguments, and this is my main area of research of interest. So I suppose I've got a lot to say about that, but I don't want to say too much about it too quickly. We need to come at it uh, from the basics first, okay? So if we're talking about good and bad arguments, so when we obviously these are evaluative terms, so we're going to move on later on to talk about how we actually go about evaluating an argument, saying whether it's good or is not. In terms of what makes a good argument, it's very difficult to say because that will depend on what perspective we take on argumentation, and it will depend on what we want to achieve with this argument. Okay, so from the rhetorical point of view, and we're going to talk more about rhetorical devices a little later on. From the rhetorical point of view, an argument is there to persuade people. So a good argument is an argument which is successful at persuading people. So by definition, any politician who gets elected had good arguments, right? His arguments were persuasive, whether or not they were logical, whether or not they were true, whether or not they made any sense, they were persuasive, and that's that. So obviously in fields like politics and advertising in particular, and you might also say in private life, right? Getting what you want in private life. In these fields, the persuasiveness of an argument is the most important thing. So even if somebody says to you, well, you committed a logical fallacy, you say, well, I don't care, right? I got what I wanted. I persuaded somebody to accept my opinion or to do what I said they should do. And that was my aim. Okay. So we need to make this distinction between when we say an argument is good, we mean it's good because it follows certain norms, certain procedures of argumentation, right? So it doesn't break certain rules that we said. And the perspective where we say, well, an argument is good because it achieved what I wanted it to achieve. So most often that's persuasion, uh, but there can be other things as well. There's an article of mine um, where I wrote about, there have been a couple of articles on this topic, but not many, where I wrote about how people use arguments as a form of showing their identity. Okay, so you may, if you're, let's say you're a vegan or a vegetarian, right, and you get into an argument with members of your family who are eating meat, you probably don't actually expect that once you talk to them about it, you don't really expect that they're all going to turn around and say, okay, you're right, I'm not going to eat meat anymore. But it's important to you to put across your view, even though you know that this argument is going to fail. Okay. So you don't, the purpose of your argument is not really to persuade people. Sometimes it might be, but very often it's not to persuade people. The purpose of your argument is simply to show who you are, to make it clear to others what you believe. Okay, this is just one example of how we can use argumentation in order to do something which is a little different, right? So even if you give very bad arguments, okay, for why you are a vegetarian, and other people are not persuaded, and other people show that you've made logical mistakes, it doesn't matter, because the whole reason for you to give these arguments was that you wanted everybody to know that you are vegetarian and that you've thought about it, that you think it's important, right? And that your reasoning is based on either on ethical issues or on something else, right? So when we judge, right, so there are different ways of judging. We can judge the effectiveness of an argument, or we can judge something internal to the argument which is not connected with the audience. These are very different ways of looking at it. So you've got the sort of the logical way of looking at it, and then the rhetorical way of looking at it. Rhetoric is much more interested in the reactions of people. Okay, so within argumentation study, we get people looking at it from both perspectives, and we need to be careful that we're always sure which perspective we are looking at it from. Okay. For the moment, for today, mainly we're going to be looking at it from the more logical perspective. Okay, it's not strictly about deductive logical validity, um, but we'll be looking at it more from that perspective. There's also the perspective, maybe which is more about what we talked about last time in pragma dialectics, which is the procedural perspective, that there is a certain procedure that you should follow in argumentation, and therefore a bad argument is one which doesn't follow the procedure. Okay, so that's we say that's even a third way of looking at it. There may be others. Okay, so we just need to be careful about when we say an argument is a bad argument, we need to be careful what exactly do we mean by that. And this notion of being careful of what exactly we mean, we'll come back to in a moment when we talk about linguistic fallacies, which is maybe my main area of expertise, which are very, very prevalent because very often we are not careful about what exactly we mean. Okay. Okay. So first of all, we've got this distinction between a rhetorical and a more logical, philosophical way of looking at arguments. Okay. So we're going to look more at rhetoric later on in the course. At the moment, we're slightly more interested in this logical philosophical argument, okay? Which is where the term fallacies comes from. The term fallacy, fallacies are recognized as being things which may well be persuasive, okay? So they're not mistakes made by people who want to be persuasive, but somehow they fail to be persuasive. They're mistakes which are they're mistakes within the internal use of the argument, although this is going to get complicated when we try to talk about what exactly fallacies are. But fallacies do not, it doesn't mean that you failed in persuasion. It means that there's something wrong with the argument from this kind of more normative perspective. Okay? Okay. In order to introduce fallacy theory, okay, we can say that this goes back to Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle produced a list of fallacies, and he claimed that these were being used by people. He claimed they were being used by people called sophists, right? Which is why fallacies are sometimes also called sophisms. There isn't actually a very good Polish translation for fallacy. Sometimes people use this word sophism in this Polish version. More often, they're just called mistakes in argument. But that's it's not a perfect description of what fallacy really means in English. Okay, so it's a little difficult. This is strange because there is a lot of very good Polish writing on argumentation and on this kind of thing, but still there isn't really an agreement on what to use instead of fallacy. So many Polish people will simply use the word fallacy. Okay, so Aristotle came up with a list of things which sophists do, which they shouldn't. He divided them into things connected with language and things not connected with language. And this is the beginning of fallacy theory, although a lot of what Aristotle wrote, the fallacies that he comes up with, these are, some of these things are more like riddles or puzzles in language. Like he'd say something and then, how can this be true? But these were not really based on arguments exactly. So some of the fallacies which he identified are still talked about. Others have been kind of forgotten, but he sort of starts this tradition. Okay. So he divided them into things connected with language, things not connected with language. And since then, there have been many, many different divisions. Every textbook has its own set of divisions. Okay. And everybody, it seems, has their own definition of what a fallacy is. And so various writers were talking about mistakes. So some people would take fallacy to mean basically logical mistakes. Other people take a much wider view of fallacies, which has all made it very, very difficult for anybody to come up with a proper fully worked out theory of fallacy, because the things which were called fallacies are so different from each other. We'll come back to that in a moment. So there are various writers who mention fallacy. The next writer that's worth talking about, who's in the notes, is John Locke. John Locke is a very famous British empiricist, philosopher. And given that he was writing in the 17th century, Locke is relatively easy to understand. His English is pretty much modern English, and his way of writing is pretty straightforward. In one passage in his most famous work, he introduced some fallacies. He doesn't use the word fallacy. He uses these as examples, basically, of bad patterns of argument. He gives them Latin names, and so all three of these are still known to some extent by their Latin names. So we've got argumentum ad verecundium, argumentum ad ignorantium, and argumentum ad hominem. Ad hominem is the most famous. It's because people still use the Latin tag ad hominem. Nowadays, of course, ad hominem is used to mean an attack on a person, not their argument, which is not exactly what Locke meant. Locke meant that an ad hominem argument was an argument which takes something about a person, something which they are already committed to, for example, and uses that to somehow undermine their position. So Locke didn't actually think that ad hominems were always wrong. So it might be that somebody is the member of a particular party or a particular religion, and they might use that to somehow undermine their position. He didn't mean just sort of insults. Nowadays, sometimes people use ad hominem attacks basically to mean the kind of insults, the sorts of responses which Donald Trump gives, where someone asks him a question at a press conference and he just says, "You're not a very good journalist." I mean, that's not the sort of ad hominem that Locke was thinking of. So it's changed a little bit. The others are also still in use, but only really theorists use these names. So argumentum ad ignorantium is simply argument from ignorance. And again, this has changed a little bit, but the basic idea of argument from ignorance is basically it's an argument from a lack of evidence, right? So if we don't know something is true, then it must be false, or if we don't know something is false, then it must be true. And this is obviously not a very good argument. I have a paper on that if you'd like to read more about that, which I think it's available probably on my website. It's a very good paper. It certainly contains an up-to-date discussion, let's put it that way. But the one that gets, in fact, the most discussion, I think, amongst theorists is ad verecundium. So ad verecundium originally meant argument from modesty. Okay, so the idea was that if someone very well respected, someone very famous, at Locke's time, this often meant the ancient authors, so people like Aristotle and Plato, but it might also be religious sources, that if somebody had said something that, particularly if you're a student, particularly if you're a younger person, you should be embarrassed to even argue with this person. How can you argue with this person? Who are you? Okay, so you should show some modesty. So this is the argument from modesty. Okay, so you want to argue with what Aristotle said, and I say, come on, don't be so arrogant. How can you argue with what he says? So this is a way of stopping people putting forward arguments. This should make you think about some of the rules that we had last week, right? So one of the first rule, or the first rule number one of pragmadialectics, was that every standpoint is permissible, that you can argue for any standpoint. So the ad verecundium argument is one that says you can't argue for certain standpoints, or you can't deny certain standpoints, because famous, brilliant, respected people have said the opposite to what you're saying, and you have no right to argue with them. Okay, so this is clearly something which was more of a problem probably in Locke's day. Nowadays we're much more accepting of debate and discussion, and we don't tend to think that famous authors must be right. Okay, certainly not in in the English-speaking world, although still perhaps in Poland in education it exists a little bit. However, the ad verecundium has often been referred to as argument from authority. And when Locke uses the word authority, but when he uses the word authority, he's talking about authorities like the ancient authors, that people looked up to people like Aristotle as some almost godlike, right? That's what he's talking about. But people have taken this argument and used the same name, ad verecundium, to refer to all arguments from authority. And arguments from authority are something which many people work on now in different fields, not just in argumentation. I have a couple of papers about this. I'm working on some papers on this at the moment. Arguments from authority are generally divided into arguments from cognitive or epistemic authority, so that's authority based on knowledge, based on ability, and what's sometimes called deontic authority or institutional authority, which is authority based on your position. Okay, so for example, as a university teacher, I may ask you to do something, or I may tell you something. Now, when I ask you to send an essay, that's my deontic authority that I'm using, and you have to send the essay because I have a position which allows me to give you instructions. When I talk to you about argumentation, I expect you to believe what I say because I expect you to treat me as an epistemic authority, as someone who knows about it. Okay, so the teacher has these two types of authority. Usually an expert, okay, is someone who has cognitive authority, and then we have people, whether it's a policeman, a politician, a judge, whatever, these people are given this institutional authority, and so we have to follow their instructions because of some role that they have in our society. So it's a society-based thing. So there is a whole big field of study connected with experts and expertise, trying to establish who is an expert, when we should believe experts, what should we do when experts argue with each other. Okay, and this all comes under this argument from authority which Locke put forward, but it's really very different from what he was suggesting. So in fact, Locke was quite open to the fact that these were bad patterns of argument which he suggested were commonly employed, but also that they could be employed in a reasonable way. Okay, so all three of these can be employed in a reasonable way. So sometimes they're used as the names of fallacies, but they're also the names of types of arguments. So clearly, argument from authority, it depends on the authority, right? So if you put forward as an authority someone who really is an expert on a topic, then saying that we should believe in something because this expert says so, that's not fallacious, right? That's perfectly reasonable. If, however, your authority happens to be some celebrity that you've been following on Instagram who doesn't know anything about this, but you just like this person, then this is a fallacious argument, right? And so when we come to evaluate the argument, we look at who the authority is and do they really have authority on this topic. Okay. Ad ignorantium arguments from ignorance, as you can read in my paper, if you look at it, everything depends upon what we would expect. Okay, so if you say, okay, there is no tiger in my living room, and I say, how do you know there's no tiger in your living room? And you say, well, I can't see any evidence of a tiger. And I say, well, he might be hiding behind the sofa. Okay, it's perfectly reasonable of you to say, well, actually, if there were a tiger in my living room, then there would be evidence. Therefore, the lack of evidence is actually a very good reason to think there's no tiger, right? Tigers don't just come into rooms and sit quietly and not damage anything. Whereas at the same time, if I say there is a spider in your room and you say, well, I can't see one, so there isn't one, I say, well, there's no reason to believe that you would be able to see evidence of a spider without looking very carefully, right? And we all know that very often there are spiders in the room, but we don't know that when we come in. So it's all about expectations. So sometimes an argument from ignorance will be a reasonable argument, sometimes it will be a bad argument, depending on the situation, depending on our expectations. Okay. The same can be true of ad hominem. For example, if we can prove that people have been dishonest in the past, then that gives us some reason to think that they might be dishonest now. Okay. So this is like something about that person which gives us reason to doubt what they're saying. Of course, that's not an attack on the argument itself, but if the argument relies on a particular person's integrity, then showing that they don't have integrity would weaken that argument. Okay. So all of these, and this will be the case with many of the so-called fallacies, right? So there are names of fallacies because they are not deductively valid arguments. They're sometimes called fallacies, but very often, and this has been the thrust of argumentation theory for some years now, we look at trying to work out which instances are reasonable and which instances are unreasonable. Okay. Okay. So something like an ad hominem, when it's an insult and not an attack on an argument, exactly. Some people say, well, it's not a fallacy because it's just an insult. A fallacy has to be something connected with an argument, and just saying you're wrong because you're stupid, that's not an argument, so it's not really an ad hominem. This is a problem for fallacy theory. The pragmadialectic approach, which we talked about last time, gets over this problem, right? Because insults would still be against the rules. So they are fallacious because they are against the rules of argumentation. Okay. Okay. There were various writings, various philosophers such as John Stuart Mill came up with a distinction which was based on whether or not evidence was used, or what type of evidence was used in the argumentation. So different philosophers had different ideas. But fallacy theory was I won't say was dead, but was dormant, let's say, was sleeping for some time. Until the publication in 1970 of Charles Hamlin's book, which I mention here in the notes. Now, Hamlin had quite a lot to say about arguments in general, but what he had to say about fallacies was very influential, in that he said that there is such a thing as a traditional approach to fallacies, which are that they are arguments which seem to be valid, but they're not valid. Okay. This creates a problem because he talks about validity, and validity, as I've mentioned, is usually associated with deductive arguments. And clearly a lot of what's written about fallacies, even before Hamlin, was not really about deductive arguments. Still, this idea that there's a traditional approach to fallacies, and that Hamlin's description of it took hold and was accepted by many people, until more recently there was a paper by Hans Hansen who showed that actually this was not the case. So what he did was he reviewed, it's worth reading this paper, he reviewed as many of the writings, and particularly textbooks, that he could find on fallacies from before Hamlin's publication, and he looked at how they defined fallacies. And what he actually discovers is that Hamlin is wrong, that there isn't a traditional approach which is based in validity. Most writers are quite flexible about how they define fallacies. But still, what Hamlin did was to show that there was a lack of a proper definition, that there were many different definitions, and Hansen confirms that there were very many different definitions. Although he's able to show, he has a table which shows which elements of the definition appear in different writers, and so he can show which are the most popular. Okay. So he gives us three things. So that fallacies are arguments, that they are arguments which are apparently valid, but they are arguments which are not valid. Okay. So part of the background to pragmadialectics was a rebellion against this point of view, right? So it's not just that they had their own theory and it led to a different type of view of fallacies. They wanted to go against this, and they cite Hamlin, Van Emeren and Grutendorf cite Hamlin in their work as this is the wrong view of fallacies, right? So our view is correct, and we're going to do it in this way. So as I said, they take a different view because they are looking at procedures of argumentation. So anything that breaks the procedure of argumentation will be fallacious, which is okay. The problem with that, though, is that one of their rules is that arguments should follow a good argumentation scheme, which basically says that one of the rules is that arguments shouldn't be fallacious in this more normally understood way, because what we normally mean by a bad argumentation scheme is one which is fallacious. So one of their rules basically is that, so it's fallacious to break the rules, and we know that it's breaking the rules because it's fallacious. So this doesn't make a lot of sense. They do obviously have more to say about what is a good argument and what is not a good argument, but that's not the main thrust of their theory. Okay, so we have a problem in that there are many things which many authors have called fallacies over the years, but these refer to different things. Some of them are kind of procedural, so things like the burden of proof, right? So rejecting the burden of proof, where you say, I'm going to make a statement, but I'm not going to defend it. Okay, that's not a fallacious argument to say I'm not going to defend it. That's a problem with procedure. You should defend it. So we can't really say that burden of proof fallacies are fallacies of that they are arguments, right? They're not arguments. Again, as I said, with many moves, unfair moves like ad hominem moves where we just insult somebody, again, these are not arguments. So they don't fit this fallacy, this idea of fallacies as being arguments or of arguments. Okay, also that there are things such as relevance. So you can put forward a very good argument which is perfectly valid, but is not relevant in this situation. So how does that relate to other types of arguments which are purely logical mistakes, and they're also called fallacies? So there is a problem. Pragmadialectics seems to be one way of solving that problem, but there are some things about that which are not so satisfying. Of course, in my work, there is a much better solution to this problem. I'll just very, very quickly say what that is. I don't want to bore you with my own research. But what I have is a system for evaluating arguments, which we will look at later on. And rather than naming fallacies and then looking at examples of text and trying to find those fallacies, what we have is an evaluation system where certain parts of the argument are evaluated, of the process, of the expression, and of the reasoning. And whenever an argument fails, then it's a fallacy of that type, depending on where it fails. So if it fails in the linguistic analysis, it's a language fallacy. And within language fallacies, there are various levels of analysis. And so the point at which it fails is the name of the fallacy. You can see a brief and I think fairly simple explanation of this on my website. I think that there is a link. Yes, probably from the main page there is a link to it's to my description of what I call informal argument semantics. Informal argument semantics is the part which assesses linguistic acceptability, but it's part of something bigger which is called CAPNA, which is the Comprehensive Assessment Procedure for Natural Argumentation. And there are some diagrams which set out exactly how this works. We will look more at this later on when we talk more about the evaluation of arguments. However, it's worth just pointing out that so this gives a new version of what is a fallacy. A fallacy is something which fails an evaluation. Okay. Okay, well that's enough to say about that at the moment. Okay, I want to move on to talking about some examples, right, which we have in the notes of different fallacies, right? So there are, to begin with, there are some purely logical fallacies, okay? There are two fallacies known as denying the antecedent, okay, and affirming the consequent, okay, which are technical terms. So denying the antecedent is when we say, and this is written in the notes, you can see to be clearer, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. Okay. So the problem with this is saying that, well, if one thing is true, then something else is true. Well, the first thing is not true, so the other thing can't be true. Now, what this does is to make the mistake of thinking that there is only one way in which something can be true. Okay. So the example that I give is, if you are a man, then you are a human. You are not a man, so you are not a human. Okay. The point is that these premises are true, right? But the mistake is to think that if we say if you're a man, then you're a human, that means somehow that you can't be a human unless you are a man. But that's obviously not what's true. It's possible to be a woman and be human as well. Okay. But this is the common type of thinking, because what we do is we connect two things in our minds. Of course, this particular example, right, we are aware that there are women who are humans and children as well. But very often that's not the case. Very often people do make this mistake because they connect two things, and then when one of those things is not true, they assume that the other one is not true either. Okay. Somehow they're kind of the opposite of this, affirming the antecedent. Okay. So here is when we have an argument that says, well, if P then Q, Q therefore P, which is saying that if one thing is true, then something else. The result is true, therefore the first thing must be true, which is to assume that there's no other way that second thing could have become true unless the first thing was true. So if we look at the example again, if you're a man, then you are human, therefore you are a man. Okay, so this is to assume that if you're a man, you are human, means that there's no other way of being human. Okay, that the only way is through this way, which is in premise one. Okay, and again, so this is a very simple logical mistake, right? The conclusion does not follow logically, but I think you can see that such mistakes do get made. Okay, that's a logical mistake. There is another type of mistake which is called begging the question, or sometimes people refer to circular reasoning. Circular reasoning and begging the question are basically the same thing. Sometimes people try to define them as being different, but this isn't really true. At least it's not an important difference. But just one thing to be careful about, the phrase begging the question really means in English that there is circular reasoning, which we're going to look at now. However, a lot of people don't understand that, and they use the phrase beg the question to mean asks the question or leads to the question. So these people are wrong, but you will see this. I mean, like 90% of native speakers do this, right? So when I say they're wrong, okay, that's me dictating to the world. Okay, so we got an example here of a religious form of argument, right? So the example in the notes is this: if you don't believe in God, He'll send you to hell. You don't want to go to hell. Conclusion: so therefore, you should believe in God. Okay. Now the point about this is that this argument is supposed to make you believe in God. Okay. Whereas if you look at the premise, He'll send you to hell, that part of the premise, is only going to be true, is only going to be acceptable for somebody who believes that He exists and is capable of sending you to hell. Right? So if you don't already believe in the conclusion, then you won't accept the premise. So within that first premise is contained the idea that you already believe in God. Okay? Or that God already exists. So any argument for the existence of God where you say someone you should believe in God because otherwise God will do something, right? This is circular reasoning. Okay? Now the thing about circular reasoning is that it's not logically invalid. Okay? Logically, you can say A, therefore A. That's logically fine. All right? So it's not a logical mistake. The argument is valid. In logic, there is a there is a symbol which kind of means therefore, but it means therefore in a way that just something logically follows from. Whereas in natural language, when we use the word therefore, we think that there is some kind of connection. So if we say A, therefore A, right? I'm sitting here, therefore I'm sitting here. Logically, that's fine. But in normal language, that's obviously not fine, because you can say, well, when I say therefore, I'm sitting here, therefore I'm sitting here, it's like, how is this first thing, second thing caused by the first thing, or something like that? So therefore has some other connotations, but in logic it doesn't. So arguments which beg the question or are completely circular are fine logically, but everybody agrees they're fallacious, which shows us that fallacies can't be just logical problems. Okay, so sometimes people actually talk about logical fallacies, in which case we have to say, well, okay, there are logical fallacies, but there are also non-logical fallacies. So this is it's a fallacy of procedure, in the sense that if you are assuming that the person you're speaking to already accepts your conclusion, well, then this is a pointless argument, right? It's pointless. That you won't persuade anybody by using an argument where they must already accept your argument in order for your argument to be true. Okay. But again, this is quite a common form of argument in real life. Okay. Many of the arguments which Aristotle talks about, particularly in his category of language, are different types of ambiguity, right? So things can have, by ambiguity, so we can talk about things which have more than one meaning. We can also talk about, so we can have a word which has more than one meaning. We can have sentences which can be understood in more than one way, right? So this would be amphiboly. And sometimes we include in here sort of vagueness that could be understood not necessarily two different meanings, but could be understood in one way or in another, which could have quite a big difference on how we think about something. So if we describe somebody as fat, this could mean that somebody is very slightly overweight, or it could mean that somebody is so big they can't get out of bed. And obviously conclusions drawn from that would be very, very different, even though you would say that the word fat has one meaning and everybody understands what it means. But degrees of this can be very different, right? So within arguments, we have to be very careful what we mean. This is what I said right at the beginning. One very common form of linguistic argument is equivocation. So what happens with equivocation is where you have a word which can be understood in two ways. Now, sometimes if you look up examples of equivocation, they'll give you really stupid arguments, which would be like, you should keep your money in a bank, therefore rivers have banks, therefore you should keep your money in the river, right? Something like that. Now, this is a stupid argument, obviously, and the point is that the word bank here has two completely unrelated meanings, right? Which nobody would ever confuse, right? No one goes and buries their money on the river bank because someone told them that banks are where you should keep the money, right? But it's the same mistake, but it's a very obvious example. Much subtler examples of equivocation are extremely common. So common that I think that this is one of the most common forms of fallacy, not just of fallacies, but of very convincing, very difficult to spot fallacies. I think that a lot of philosophers, a lot of academics commit this fallacy all the time. Okay, the fallacy of equivocation, where a word has more or less one meaning, but it can be understood in slightly different ways, and that can be a very, very small difference. But it's used, and this is the point about equivocation as a fallacy, it's used in two different ways within the same argument. Okay, so the example that I give here is an example which is quite a common one in political discourse in Britain, but the same will be true everywhere, right? So you've got the argument that says poverty in the United Kingdom is rising, people living in poverty is a social ill, the government has a duty to fight social ills, therefore the government in the UK has a duty to tackle the rise in poverty in the UK. Okay. Now the problem here is that we can, if we start at the bottom, right? Premise 3, the government has a duty to fight social ills. Well, we may agree or disagree to some extent, but generally, okay, we'll accept it. There's no use of the word poverty here. The problem is the word poverty is used in the first two premises. So we need to look very carefully. Does it mean exactly the same thing? Now, when we say poverty in the UK is rising, what we mean here, or what is usually meant by commentators, by politicians, is that on the official measures of poverty, okay, poverty is rising. When we say people living in poverty as a social ill, we're generally thinking of poverty as being very bad material conditions. Okay, these poverties are not the same thing. The poverty in the UK which is rising, which is shown to be rising through statistics, is poverty which is worked out statistically on the percentage of people's income, the income that people have as a percentage of average income. Okay, so when the average income in the country goes up, then more people are in poverty, because all those people who have slightly lower income are automatically, they fall below this threshold. So it's something like 60% of median income. So if you have less than 60% of the median income, you are in poverty. So if median income goes up, more people are in poverty without any change to their material circumstances. Okay, and so this figure rises when you have more rich people. The more rich people you have, the higher these median incomes are, and therefore more people are in poverty without any change. Okay. Now, whether or not that is itself a social ill is another question. But really, the social ill there would be inequality rather than poverty. Most people, when they hear the word poverty, they think about people living in very, very poor conditions. So most people would agree with the conclusion that the government has a duty to help people living in very, very poor conditions, right? 6 people to a room and no toilets and all these kinds of things, children without food. Whereas not everybody would agree that the government has a duty to tackle inequality of income, when in fact the poorest people are living in reasonable accommodation and they do have enough food and so on. Okay. Of course, in every society there are people who are really in serious problems for different reasons. But this is a question, when we say poverty is rising, this is based on these surveys of people's income. Okay, so there is a subtle, poverty seems to have one meaning, but here there is a subtle equivocation on the word poverty. Okay. Okay, so at the end of the notes, we seem to be going on for a long time today. At the end of the notes, there's a list of, which I just put together this list of what I think are the most common, these are the most common in the literature. Okay, I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily the most common in the world, because that would require an experiment, that would require a huge empirical check on what exactly people are saying to each other. But we can be fairly certain that the ones which researchers talk about are the ones which researchers have noticed and seem to be causing problems. Okay, so we've got the list here. We start with Locke's ad hominem ad ignorantium ad verecundium, which we've already talked about. There are some more ad fallacies. They're known as ad fallacies. So we have ad baculum, which is an appeal to fear, which means that basically we persuade people with threats. You should do this because if you don't, I will hit you. You could also say that the argument that I talked about before about you should believe in God, otherwise he'll send you to hell, that this is also an argument from fear, right? That you should believe something to be true, because if you don't believe it to be true, then you will be somehow punished. Ad misericordium, the appeal to pity. Okay, so this is what happens when students come and say, I didn't do my essay on time, but I'm having a very difficult time at home, and my life is hard, and so on and so on and so on. Sometimes those kind of excuses will be valid excuses, right? So even, well, you might even say sometimes ad misericordiam arguments are sometimes valid, but usually um, these are simply appeals to make the person feel sorry for you, and therefore to change their actions on the basis of feeling sorry for you, not because really those circumstances have made it impossible for you to do something. Okay, most of these are fairly straightforward. Ad populum, appeal to the people. What is commonly believed to be true must be so. Again, usually this is a good argument, right? If everybody thinks something is true, probably it's because it is, right? I mean, in basic um, everyday life, that's usually true, right? If there is a general agreement about something, it's probably because it's true. That might not be true in science or philosophy, but in everyday life, that's true. Okay, appeal to consequences. Now, obviously, when we're talking about actions, the appeal to a consequence is a very good argument, right? So you need to say, well, look, if you do this, this is going to happen. That's perfectly fair. But the appeal to consequences as a fallacy is a claim that something is true because it leads to good consequences, or it's false because it leads to bad consequences. Okay, so you're actually saying that this must be the case because if it isn't the case, something bad is going to happen, right? Well, obviously, whether or not something bad is going to happen has no influence on whether something is true. Okay. Appeal to tradition. So we've always done it, so it must be right. And again, this is a type of reasoning, we call this a heuristic, okay? So these are like, heuristics are very simple, quick and easy rules that we use when we're thinking. Generally speaking, if people have always done something in one way, probably it's because it's the right way of doing it, okay? But of course, we can all think of examples when that's not true. Begging the question we've talked about. Fallacies of composition and division, these are mentioned by Aristotle, but Aristotle mentions these as linguistic fallacies, and it's to do with the structure of sentences. The modern versions of these are different. So the composition fallacy, what is true of a part must be true of the whole. Okay, that's like saying all Muslims are terrorists, right? So just because there are some Muslim terrorists, that doesn't mean that every Muslim is a terrorist, right? The division fallacy, what's true of the whole must be true of each part. Okay, so this is like if we say that a particular, okay, so Barcelona are a very good football team, so every player who plays for Barcelona must be very good. Okay, this isn't true, right? They have Messi, which means that they can get away with having some quite weak players. Okay, what else do we have? Equivocation we've talked about. False analogy, arguments from analogy are a huge field of arguments. There is even some kind of idea that all arguments are somehow based on analogy. So arguments from analogy can be good. And again, so the fallacy is an argument from false analogy where, in fact, two things are not similar, or they are similar but not in a relevant way. Okay, so there may be a similarity, but it isn't relevant to the particular case that we're talking about. False dichotomy is where we say it's either this or it's this, and we exclude other opportunities, other possibilities. So we say something must be true because the other possibility is not true, okay, without thinking that there might be a third way, okay. The next one is irrelevant argumentation. So this ignoratio elenchi, this is just the old-fashioned way of saying an irrelevant argument or irrelevant conclusion. Persuasive definition. This is not always included in lists of fallacies. This is something which I've have paid some attention to in my linguistic analysis. Persuasive definition is where we redefine the meaning of a word to suit what we want to think. So sometimes you'll see in a list of fallacies something called the no true Scotsman argument, but the no true Scotsman argument is just a type of persuasive definition. So the no true Scotsman argument runs like this. This is why it's a Scotsman, right? It's about porridge. So you say something like, every Scotsman loves porridge, okay? And then your friend from Edinburgh says, I don't like porridge. And you say, well, no, you say, no true Scotsman would say that. So you're not a true Scotsman. Okay, so what you're doing is the normal definition of Scotsman obviously is somebody from Scotland. But then what you're doing is saying that someone who doesn't like porridge isn't a real Scotsman. So you're changing the definition, not from someone who's from Scotland, but from someone who's from Scotland and likes porridge. Well, of course, your argument that all Scotsmen like porridge is going to be true if part of your definition of Scotsman is that they like porridge. Okay. One other with a Latin name, post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is claiming that an event which follows another must have been caused by it, right? So this is a very common thing that we see two things together, and we assume that one must be the cause of the other, even though we don't necessarily have reason to think that. And finally, two more which are, again, very popular in the literature. Slippery slope. I've written a couple of articles about this. The idea of slippery slope is that if we take one action, it will inevitably lead to other actions. And so even though the first action doesn't appear to have any bad consequences, it will actually lead to other actions which do have bad consequences. Again, if you're interested in that, you should read my article on this, which is very good, like all of my articles, and gives a good explanation of it. And finally, the straw man argument is another one which has received a lot of attention recently. Straw man argument is where we set up a straw man. A straw man is very easy to defeat. So what we do is we rephrase, or we simply express our opponent's argument in a very, very weak way. Okay, and then it's easy to defeat, and then we claim victory. All right, but this is unfair on our opponent. So it involves a misrepresentation of one's opponent. Okay. So as I said, all of these have their own literature, and there's a lot of stuff about all of these ones. There are a lot of, if you look on, for example, on Wikipedia for informal fallacies, you'll find like 100. There are also books of argument fallacies which run to like 300-400 different fallacies, but these are all just using different names basically for the same thing, or using fallacies for very, very particular arguments which are not really important enough to be considered theoretically. Okay, so what you're going to do next is you're going to get a text which I will post, and you will look at that text and try to find what's wrong with the argument. Okay, there are a number of things wrong with the argument. Maybe I'll also give you a kind of little test with just some very brief arguments, and you can just join the names of the arguments to the fallacious reasoning. Okay, so we'll do a little bit of practice with that. I'm thinking that maybe it would be a good idea for us to have some kind of meeting. So maybe I'll establish a group on Teams. I don't know how you feel about using that. And then we could discuss this task, right? Because I want you to look at this text and I want you to come up with your own opinions about it, but I'd like to kind of talk to you about it a little bit. So I think that what we'll do, I will give you that task, and then we will arrange a time, maybe for after Easter, where we can actually have a meeting and we can discuss it. The time will be our normal class time, right? So there's no question of people saying that they're busy, because you're not busy, because it's our class time. Okay, all right. I'll put more about that on the website when I've given that some more thought. For now, I'll finish. I've been talking for a long time. So look out for the task which is coming, and try to apply some of what we've been talking about to your assessment of it. Even if you're not able to use the technical terms, and you're not able to express exactly why you think something is wrong, just highlight it and say, this is wrong and it doesn't seem right for whatever reason, but without worrying too much about whether you've got the technical name for the fallacy or not. Okay, right. So I'm going to finish there, and look out for more things coming up on the website. Okay, bye-bye for now.